All right, guys, so this is going to be the final video before the exam. This will be on altered cellular and tissue biology, focusing on cellular adaptations. So how do cells adapt to different conditions, and what kind of conditions lead to cellular injury? So for example, some of these changes are reversible. I want to say that up front. And what we're looking at is cell size, perhaps. Are the cells getting smaller? Are they getting larger? Or are you getting fewer of them? Is it a pure numbers game? So for example, you have atrophy versus hypertrophy. Okay, if it's atrophy, it's a decrease in cellular size. The cells are getting smaller. The organs that are kind of most vulnerable to this would be places like your heart, your skeletal muscles, secondary sex organs, and the brain. Now, physiological atrophy is normal. That occurs with development. But if it's pathological atrophy, that means it's occurring because of reduced workload, perhaps. Okay, so you see that sometimes people's cellular skeletal muscle will atrophy if they're not using it, perhaps if they're bedridden, not walking, and then when they start walking again, hopefully it will come back and you have the strength that you had previous to that. If it's hypertrophy, okay, it's a compensatory increase in the size of the cells. So with these two, we're talking about changes in size, not number of cells. Okay, so you get an increase in the size of the cells of the affected organ. Most of the time, these effects are reversible, so you can have regression. This is versus something like hyperplasia. Okay, when someone has hyperplasia, it means there's been an increased rate in cell division and you're getting more cells. Sometimes this is compensatory. Okay, meaning cells of the liver, you can have regeneration if there's, it's an adaptive mechanism in the liver that cells can regenerate, for example, or you can have hormonal hyperplasia. This happens sometimes in hormone-sensitive tissue like the breast, for example, and the uterus in females, or you can have it be pathological. And an example of pathological hyperplasia would be something like, and let's walk through this example now, an example would be something like BPH. BPH stands for benign prostate hyperplasia. So this is an increase in the size of the prostate. So because of the B, we see benign, so it's not cancerous, okay? So enlarged prostate is probably one of the more common issues that occurs in men over a certain age. Obviously, women don't have a prostate, so they can't experience BPH. So this is thought to be because of changes in hormone levels that occur with age. So what happens is, if we think about, here's our bladder, here's the urethra, the prostate's right under the bladder, and then the urethra would thread through the penis in men. Because, okay, so here's your bladder, and here's the prostate. Remember, the prostate is about the size of a walnut. It's just inferior to the bladder. So if someone's prostate enlarges, two things are going to happen in terms of outcomes that we would see as symptoms. Number one, if this is swelling, it's going to push up on the bladder. So that's going to push pressure onto the bladder wall. So someone's going to feel like they have to urinate fairly frequently. In addition, there's going to be pressure, because remember, this would be in 3 dimensions around the urethra. Pressure kind of pushing down on the wall of the urethra as well. So as urine tries to exit the bladder, you're going to get what's called an interrupted urine stream, because it's not going to come out smoothly, okay? So you see that with BPH. You have increased frequency, that urge to urinate, but when someone urinates, their urine output is interrupted. You have an interrupted urine stream. So there's a couple different treatments for BPH, because it is thought to be hormonal in nature. When you correct the hormonal imbalance, you can have regression of the prostate and have complete relief of symptoms. They can also treat by relaxing some of the musculature around the urethra and the bladder, so that you get more complete voiding of the bladder when someone tries to void their bladder. This is not prostate cancer. That's a little bit different. Obviously, then it's no longer benign. This is also not prostatitis. When someone has prostatitis, they have a bacterial inflammation of the prostate. That's usually treated with antibiotics. The signs and symptoms are kind of the same thing. So then you have to figure out how would you tease apart which one it is. You could simply look at the white blood cell count. If it's infectious, the white cell count should be higher. Okay. Let's talk about cellular injury. So when we're talking about cellular injury, sometimes the effects are irreversible, sometimes they are reversible. Probably one of the most common would be hypoxic injury. What it means when someone has cells have hypoxic injury, it means that they have a lack of sufficient oxygen to their cells. This is probably the most common cause of cellular injury and may be caused by things that we wouldn't necessarily think of as disease states per se, okay? It can be simply caused by a decrease in oxygen content in the air, which would occur at higher altitude, of course, or by the loss of hemoglobin or misshapen or a poor red blood cell level, of course, as well, right? If you have less hemoglobin or fewer red blood cells, you could also incur hypoxic injury as well. COPT, if people have respiratory diseases. And we're going to talk about that separately. So when someone has certain types of respiratory issues can result in hypoxic injury as well. Poisoning of the oxidative enzymes of the electron transport chain can result in hypoxic injury. So for example, cyanide poisoning back in the late 70s, early 80s when Tylenol was laced with cyanide. What it did is it disrupted a process called the electron transport chain in the mitochondria, and by doing that, people had oxygen in their bloodstream, but the cells could not process the oxygen and they suffered hypoxic injury and death. What can occur kind of ahead of this, right, is you can have something called ischemia. Or you can have ischemic conditions. What that means, it's a little bit different than hypoxia. It means that when you have ischemia, it means you have decreased blood flow to an organ or to tissue. But eventually, if you have significantly decreased blood flow to an organ, obviously you're going to incur some hypoxic injury because the cells aren't getting enough oxygen. This can occur with narrowing of an artery, thrombosis, embolus, etc. Another type of cellular injury is oxidative stress. Okay. Where does oxidative stress come from? Okay, oxidative stress is induced by things called free radicals. Okay. Normally you have the generation of, let me back up. In your body, you have a type of reaction. It's called a redox reaction or an oxidative reduction reaction. This is a type of chemical reaction. This is a normal part of your metabolism, okay? A redox reaction, put in the most simplest terms, means you're transferring electrons from one molecule to another. Oversimplified, but that's okay. As part of redox reactions, we generate what are called reactive oxygen species, okay, or free radicals. Free radicals then need to be bound up by antioxidants before they cause any damage, and they can cause any whole types of damage, okay? If we generate more free radicals than our normally occurring endogenous antioxidants can handle, then you can incur oxidative stress and damage, okay? This is the type of cell damage that will occur with just with general aging, with chemical or radiation. Sometimes when you apply radiation to tissue, for example, in cancer treatment, you can generate oxidative stress. Ischemia, reperfusion injury, which we'll discuss when we discuss cardiac issues, and by certain microbes. The antioxidant species that normally occur in our body would include things like certain vitamins, like vitamin E and vitamin C, but also things like cysteine and glutathione. What these do is they either block the synthesis of free radicals, okay, and that kind of renders them safe, for lack of a better word, or inactivates them. And if you inactivate the free radical, it can't cause the damage that it would normally cause. Some of the types of damage that would occur with oxidative stress and overproduction or over intake of free radicals would be things like, you'd have protein modifications. Proteins would now be rendered non-functional. Remember, their structure and function are tightly related. So if you mess with the structure, you're going to mess with the function of certain proteins. Can cause DNA damage and mutation. Can cause mitochondrial damage, lipid damage, which can disrupt. Remember, your cell membranes are made of lipid. If I disrupt the structure of some lipids, well, then I'm not going to have the appropriate cell membranes that I need for the cell to continue on its life. Free radical generation would cause things, you can have something simple, right? Exposure to the sun can cause, that radiation can cause the generation of free radicals and damage to skin. Okay, that's going to cover cellular injury.